you all. Welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about Puritans. Puritanism, a lot of times when people talk about the religious foundations of the United States, they will point to the Puritans as an example of how early colonial settlement was very Christian and very religious in its outlook. And so the Puritans have a very important part of U.S. history or pre-U.S. history, the colonial period, that become influential even further on. So I want us to think about who the Puritans are, what they did, what was the cultural contribution that they left, and maybe what are the limits of that contribution as well. So as we think about what can be referred to as the Puritan legacy, I want us to think about how there was a very rich and vibrant form of Christianity that undergirded colonial culture and eventually U.S. culture too. And I want us to think about how there are limitations on that. So sometimes when people talk about the religious foundations of the nation, they often convolute notions of fleeing religious persecution with religious freedom. And I want us to think about how there is a difference between fleeing religious persecution and advocating for religious freedom. Sometimes those things get pushed together when we're trying to pull meaning out of the past, and I want us to be able to have a more nuanced version of that. I also want us to think about the differences between words like Puritans and Pilgrims, because these are actually different communities that are very similar, that came here in the 1600s after Jamestown was established. And so the differences of these are important. So before we jump into that, I want us to think about who are the Puritans or the Pilgrims? Where do they come from? We saw last time that in Jamestown there was essentially Anglican people who were coming here. They were Church of England, right? They weren't fleeing persecution, established on the Chesapeake there, Jamestown. Eventually that society emerged into a slave-holding society where slavery developed through the law, which we've seen, and began to take a colonial or a group of colonists who were originally establishing that colony for economic gain, and it became a empire of slavery as the decades marched on. Puritan society is going to look a little bit different. So to understand Puritans, we do need to understand this movement for personal or freedom of religion for their community. So they are fleeing persecution. They are seeking their own religious freedom because they are persecuted in England. But we'll see that they're not often going to allow other people in the New World to practice religion in the same sense that they want to for themselves, right? So if you remember in the English Reformation that we talked about, in the English Reformation, we had King Henry that broke, right, because he wanted a divorce. And if you remember that Reformation wasn't quite as total as, say, the Lutheran Reformation or something that we saw, that it didn't tear down the whole structures of the Catholic Church. It kind of just reappropriated them in an English version. So if you'll notice, if you remember, the structure of the Catholic Church is Pope is, the highest authority. Then we have cardinals, bishops, priests. Eventually we have laymen, right? People who go to church. The Anglican Church or the English Church is going to look very similar. Instead of the Pope at the top, it's essentially the king, but it's still going to have cardinals, bishops, priests, all the way down. And they might practice different things. Priests don't necessarily have to, abstain from sex or things like that, but the structure is very similar. Puritans are essentially reformers, much like Martin Luther or John Calvin. They're actually going to look to John Calvin as an inspiration a lot of times. And they're going to look at the English church and they're going to say the Reformation didn't go far enough in England, right? So they're going to continue to push back against the English church, specifically the power structures of the English church, and say that the Reformation needs to level some of those power structures. Now, obviously, especially with this being a state religion, a state Christianity in the Anglican church, this is going to be problematic in not just the priests and cardinals' minds, but the king himself, who is at the head of that church, right? So very quickly, these Puritans, who in their mind are trying to purify the English church, make it what they think a true Christian church should be, begin to be persecuted. Some think that they should just completely break from the English church. Others think that they should continue to try to reform it from within. And that's really that distinction we see. These, the pilgrims that end up landing in Plymouth Colony are separatists, right? They're wanting to separate from the Anglican church and create a new church. Originally, they flee from England and they go to the Netherlands. The Netherlands is known for being more religiously tolerant. Very quickly, they realize that that's not going to work out for a number of reasons. One is that they feel like their children, once they grow up, might not be so Christian in that society. So, for a number of reasons, they end up leaving the Netherlands and they end up looking to the New World. When we think about the Pilgrims that land on Plymouth in 1620 established that Plymouth colony, they're essentially these English separatists. Originally, the Pilgrims tried to make it to Virginia and ended up getting kind of blown up coast and just establishing themselves in Massachusetts there. When the Pilgrims get here in 1620, they famously sign this Mayflower Compact where they say that we're going to come together and create under the king and under God in their minds. They're going to create a new society. Very early on, they're in the same trouble that the Virginia colonies were in just a few years earlier, facing very cold winters. They're unable to grow the food that they need to grow, and they are reliant on Native Americans. So that story of Thanksgiving, where the Native American Squanto, who was previously captured, learned English, and ends up finding his way back into Native American society there, is able to kind of barter an uneasy peace between them and the Native Americans. And they're able to rely on those Native communities to initially help them early on. This is something like all of the other instances where the settlers end up having these uneasy reliance with Native Americans. It's an uneasy peace that doesn't last very long. So in 1630, after the Pilgrims established the Plymouth colony, there's another group of So in 1630, after the Pilgrims established the Plymouth colony, there is another group of people fleeing England in order to practice a more rigorous form of Christianity than they think the Anglican Church is practicing. And so these come and they establish the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1630. And so the Massachusetts Bay Colony is established by Puritans, right? These are people who are wanting to purify the English church. They end up coming here because of persecution, and what they want to do is set up essentially a Christian society. I want us to think about the implications of how they thought and saw the world and how this created the structures of their families, their early government, the demographics of their society, and how this really was a holistic worldview established. So what did the Puritans think? The Puritans are going to subscribe to this idea of Reformed theology, and it's essentially Calvinist theology. We saw how John Calvin, after Luther broke from the Catholic Church, ended up establishing a more systematic way of thinking about Protestant theology. So they are Protestants. They're a specific form of Protestants, and they're going to adhere to a lot of those Calvinistic ideas. And I kind of want us to get in the head of the Puritans here for just a second. So Puritans are essentially going to believe in this idea of total depravity, right? This is a Calvinistic way of thinking. The idea here is not that every person is completely depraved and, is a serial killer or something like that, but it's the idea that in their minds that the story of Adam and Eve was literally true, and that after that event, when Eve ate the apple and they fell from grace and were pushed out of the Garden of Eden, when they had children, those children were tainted by that sin, that brokenness, right? There's something inherently broken in every person after that. So what that means is that each person is broken from the perfection of God in such a way that God has to actually reach into time and choose to give that person the free gift of salvation. So if you think about that, that's really coming off of those Calvinistic ideas of there is nothing that a person can do, pay money, do good works, be a good person at all. There's nothing that can be done to produce salvation or to make sure a person goes to heaven. That it's actually the free choice of God who chooses to give people faith, and then that faith in Christianity is what saves them. So that idea of predestination is going to be very important when it comes to Reform or Puritan theology. The idea that not just certain people are chosen by God to be saved, or on the flip side, be chosen to not be saved or go to hell, but that certain kingdoms are chosen by God to be the chosen people. So this idea of providence, the idea that God is controlling literally every event in history, is very central to Puritan ideas. A person doesn't, you really can't even know if you are one of the chosen or elect that's going to be saved or not, right? So they have this idea of the visible versus the invisible church. The idea here is that all of society, or all of Puritan society, is part of the church. There are church events, there are church services multiple times a week. Everybody goes. You know if somebody doesn't go that they're not one of the saved, right? But even those who are there, they can't be sure who is actually in and who is actually out. So you can see how this breeds not just a often rigorous introspection, right, where people are really worried about their own salvation, but it also breeds a real interest or real tendency to want to control the behaviors of other people, right? If you see somebody who is drinking or gambling, or if you see somebody who doesn't come to church or has had an adulterous affair, it's a pretty clear indicator that they're not one of the saved in the Puritan mind. So it very quickly creates a structure of control that Puritans are known for. It also, I think in probably our common way the word Puritan is used, typically if someone refers to something as Puritan or puritanical, it also has this connotation of being like prudish or not wanting to talk about sex, right? And I think that comes from this too. Although Puritans did very much celebrate sex within heterosexual lifelong marriage. And that's when we begin to think about these traditional values that will begin to shape American culture for a very long time, this goes back to not just the Puritans, but Protestant Christianity in general, right? So they are also going to do very specific things. They're going to have Sabbath laws where you can't work on Sundays. They're going to say you can't play cards or games of chance. This is not just because gambling is wrong. That's often, that's obviously true to them. But it's also because even if you're not gambling, the idea that there is chance is actually offensive to the existence of God, because God controls literally everything. There is no such thing as chance in the Puritan mind. Interestingly enough, they're going to not celebrate Easter or Christmas. Sometimes we would think that the Puritans would celebrate Easter and Christmas, but they're going to see both of those things, both Easter and Christmas, as pagan holidays that Christians came along and essentially stamped Christianity on. And if you trace the history of those, they're going to say those were not actually Christian celebrations. We don't know when Jesus was born, according to them. Easter was essentially a pagan celebration of fertility that Christians put essentially the Jesus narrative on top. So they're going to not participate in those. They're going to promote modesty. Remember, going back to that idea of, there's a very rigid form of where sexuality should be celebrated, and that is very much in the modest heterosexual Christian, often towards procreation, right? That even sex for sex's sake is not a fundamental way of understanding the way sexuality should work. Interestingly enough, they are going to, we think of Puritans, we might think, they probably don't drink alcohol, but this is that prohibition against alcohol from a Christian perspective is something that's not really going to emerge in American society until really about 200 years after this. 200 years after. So you can't get drunk, right? If you get drunk and you're stumbling around town, then you can actually go to jail and get locked up, because drunkenness is not allowed. But drinking beer is something that they do, they accept and even celebrate. So often when you talk about this form of society that they try to establish, the word theocracy gets used. And this is really important because that word theocracy, we're going to see a couple of ocracy words: democracy, autocracy. There's a lot of ways in which those words have been used, but if you break it apart, right, ocracy essentially means like law or rule. So theocracy, theos is God, so God rule. So essentially what they're trying to do is establish a society where the rule of God, or really the Christian scriptures, the Bible, is essentially the method of truth, right, for that society. And so theocracy means that God rules. Now the problem with that is that God is notoriously invisible and silent. So what that means is, in really all theocracies, is that there is a person or group of people that interpret that for other people, right? So it is these, Puritan religious leaders that will eventually interpret what is and what is not God's will for the people, right? Through their interpretation of the Christian scriptures. So another important distinction between, say, Jamestown and the northern colonies here in Massachusetts is going to be the family. So Puritans are big on family. They're actually going to come here fleeing persecution, not just with whole families, but with whole churches. And so if you remember, those early Jamestown settlers are largely male. They're largely there to make money. They're largely there for different reasons. They're not trying to set up a group of families or churches to create a religious society in the same sense, right? So Puritans are going to see themselves as, their families are essentially little commonwealths. They're like little governments in which husband is over the wife, Christ is over the husband, wife is over the children. We can see this traditional kind of idea of what a family is very rooted in Puritan society, and they believe that God ordained it that way, right? That's the way it's supposed to be. Family, church and state, government, everything is inseparable. This word patriarchal also gets used. I think that we all are probably familiar with the word patriarchy, but again, that's one of those ocracy words, right? It means father rule or led by the male. And so this is something that is very integral to Puritan society. One of the interesting things about patriarchal or male-led society that's going to come out of Puritan culture is that it is slightly more democratic than many other places in the world. So, if you are a man in good standing in Puritan culture, even if you're poor or rich or whatever, you will be able to come as an equal in the church and vote for things. So some people see, these town meetings or the ability to engage in church and state at this point as being a little step in a more of an egalitarian society. But detractors would say that whatever distinction that is, it still completely negates the idea of slaves, which they did accept. Although slavery was not widely practiced in Puritan society, it was accepted. There were instances of it. It overlooks the fact of women in Puritan society. We'll see very quickly that becomes a very tenuous issue. And so if we think about the limits of representation politically or in the church, that patriarchal society and that specifically that being a male participant in the church, right? So if you're outside of the church, Native Americans, slaves, and then women within the church, there are hard limits on those things, right? So theocracy and patriarchy are something that are definitely going to define this community. Here's something that's very interesting that begins to happen is Puritans begin to establish many different villages, churches. They're fishing and trading. They become very successful. They become very populous because you remember they celebrate procreation within marriage. So whereas Jamestown and places in Virginia in the South, they're having had a kind of a hard time procreating because there's a lot of single males down there. Puritan society is not going to be like that. But through procreation, they're going to become extremely populous very quickly. Interestingly enough, there is a tension in Puritanism that we're really going to be able to draw out this distinction between fleeing religious persecution and trying to establish religious freedom. Puritans believe that everyone should read the Bible. They're very big on education. They're very big on literacy because they want people to be able to read the scriptures. Remember, that's a really core tenet of Protestant Christianity. You need to be able to read and understand the scriptures. The paradox here is that if someone doesn't come to the same conclusions about how the scripture should be interpreted, their various interpretations are not going to be accepted. So we're going to see that it becomes very pro-reading, educating yourselves on religious matters until people come to different conclusions about what that means, right? And so some really interesting examples of this are Roger Williams, who very early on in the 1630s is going to establish himself in Massachusetts, and he's going to see himself as a Puritan's Puritan. Roger Williams is really he's about finding out the truth. He wants to understand what the nature of reality is. He wants to be a good Christian. And so he begins to, read and see what's going on in society, and he's going to become very critical of a couple of things. One, he's going to criticize the way Native Americans are treated by the Puritans, and so he's going to be outspoken about that. He's going to want to go off into Native American communities and establish relationships with this. And he's also going to say that there are things in which the Puritans do that are actually counter to religion. So he's going to point to the fact that, according to Puritan law, if you don't come to church, if you're not involved, every time you're supposed to be there, it's essentially coercive, right? Then you become ostracized, you become in trouble. You can actually be fined and there can be consequences for it, right? Or even pushed out of society. And so what Roger Williams is going to say is that doesn't foster true religion. That there shouldn't be communal standards or coercive laws that make people adhere to religious things, right? So some people are going to see Roger Williams as kind of an early supporter of the separation of church and state, right? Puritans are not going to separate church and state at all. If you were caught fornicating, committing adultery, doing something that's a moral sin, there can be legal consequences for it. Roger Williams is going to say he's going to begin to advocate for things that will begin to look like that the church shouldn't be able to tell you how to behave because, and this isn't because he's advocating for unbelief, it's because he thinks that true religion has to be voluntary. When he begins to voice these concerns, Roger Williams is going to get banished in 1635. And so he's going to actually go establish Providence, Rhode Island, not far from Massachusetts. And Providence, Rhode Island becomes kind of a beacon or a resting place for people who are fleeing Puritan societies in order to practice other forms of religion. So it's a really good example of how, the Puritans come here to establish a colony for religious, to flee persecution, and then they create something that actually makes other people have to flee to practice their own versions of religion. Another great example is Anne Hutchinson. So Anne Hutchinson, like Roger Williams, is a devout believer. She's in it, right? And she's studying and reading, and she starts having these meetings in between the ones at church where people meet in her house, and she's telling, she's expounding on the Christian scriptures, she's teaching groups, and she's really good at it. And very quickly people are like, hey, you teach better than the guy on Sunday, right? And this begins to get her in trouble. And eventually she's called before John Winthrop, the author, the main leader of the Massachusetts Bay Colony that we are going to read here this week, that wrote that City on the Hill. John Winthrop's essentially going to say, on what authority are you doing this? This council and Winthrop together. And so she's going to make a couple mistakes. One, she's going to be teaching men, and so that's an overstep. She's going to say that the Holy Spirit tells me, like there is this direct connection, she believes in her mind, between her and God. And so there's two things that are really going to get her in trouble here. One, she's a woman teaching men, right? That's one of the main things that gets her in trouble. And then she's going to say that that there is a relationship or a communication that actually can supersede the Christian scriptures, right? She can go above and beyond the scriptures. And she even goes as far as to say that, that can help her know who is saved and who isn't saved, right? That she has some spiritual insight that the leaders of the church don't even have. And she'll start pointing some of those out. Obviously, these things are going to get her in a lot of trouble with the leadership. John Winthrop's the one that actually files formal charges against her in 1637. And he's going to say, you've put yourself essentially in the place of a man teaching woman. You've blasphemed God by doing that. And so eventually Anne Hutchinson and her entire family is going to be banished from Puritan society. They're going to go to Providence. They're going to go up to Rhode Island for a little bit. Eventually they'll make their way up to New York, where I think her whole family, except for one child, I believe, is killed by Native Americans. Again, Anne Hutchinson is a really good example about the patriarchal limits and really just the limits of religious freedom that exist in Puritan society. Lastly, there's the Quakers. And so in the 1650s, there's this real influx of Quakers into Puritan society. And so Quakers are another splinter group of Protestantism that come out. And they essentially have done the same thing that a lot of Protestant groups begin to do, is they read the Christian scriptures and they come to their own conclusions about them. And that conclusion differs from the Christian church in England. It differs from the Puritan church in Massachusetts. And in a lot of ways, the Quakers do the same thing that Anne Hutchinson does, but maybe even on a grander scale. So, they're going to say that when they read the Christian scriptures, they come to the conclusion that it teaches that there's no such thing as sex when it comes to the soul, right? So souls in God's eyes don't have, what we would say gender or sex. Now, big no-no for Puritans, right? And then they're also going to say that not only does maybe one person have the ability to hear God in a way to interpret the scriptures above what the scriptures say or something, but everyone has an inner light, right? And so questioning patriarchy and then this divine connection that goes above and beyond the Christian scriptures are going to put them at odds with the Puritans. This is a really clear example of the limits of religious freedom in Puritan society. Just like Roger Williams, just like Anne Hutchinson, we're going to see that the Quakers are, they are persecuted within Puritan society. They're going to be branded, they're going to be whipped, dragged behind cars, hanged, killed, right? So this is something that I really want us to focus on. If we think about the Puritans as establishing a Christian-based society in the colonial world, fleeing persecution from England, right? That is very much true. But very quickly, those that are fleeing persecution from, think about what's happening. There have to be, the people who flee persecution from England establish a place where people have to flee from persecution from, right? So this idea of religious toleration or religious freedom is very not present in Puritan society. And I want us to think about the significance of that in relationship to the difference between fleeing persecution and offering religious freedom.